Right now, as you watch this, your connection to the outside world is running through a cable about the diameter of a garden hose, sitting in the dark, 3 kilometers underwater. You've heard that satellites carry the internet. Everyone has. It's one of those things that sounds right, feels modern, and is almost completely wrong. So, where does the signal actually go? And why does almost nobody know? There are roughly 400 submarine cable systems on the ocean floor today. They carry approximately 99% of all international internet traffic. Not some of it, not most of it, virtually all of it. The cables themselves are not dramatic objects. The deep sea sections are roughly 25 millimeters in diameter, slimmer than your wrist. Closer to shore, where anchors drag and fishing trawlers work, they're armored, steel wire wrapped around a copper tube wrapped around a fiber-optic core thinner than a human hair. But in the deep ocean, where the pressure alone deters interference, they lie mostly bare. The total length of this network is extraordinary. If you laid every active submarine cable end to end, you'd cross about 1.3 million kilometers. That's roughly 3.5 times the distance to the moon. And here is the part that catches most people off guard. These cables are not a government project. They are not a military infrastructure maintained by navies. They are largely private commercial assets. And increasingly, they are owned not by telephone companies, but by the same technology corporations that run your email, your search results, and your cloud storage. We built a civilization-critical network, laid it on the seafloor, and then left most of it largely unarmored, unguarded, and invisible to the people whose lives depend on it. To understand how that happened, and why it matters more now than it ever has before, we have to start a lot further back. The first submarine telegraph cable crossed the English Channel in 1850. It lasted one day before a French fisherman, spotting something strange on the seafloor, hauled it up and cut a section off to examine the gold he thought he'd found inside. The engineers went back. The second cable lasted longer. By 1858, a team backed by the financier Cyrus Field had laid the first transatlantic cable, 2,600 kilometers of copper wire across the North Atlantic seabed, connecting Valentia Island in Ireland to Trinity Bay in Newfoundland. Queen Victoria sent a congratulatory telegram to President Buchanan. The message took 17 hours to transmit. That cable failed within 3 weeks. A colleague of Field's had tried to boost the signal voltage and burned out the insulation. But the principle was proven, and the money kept coming. By 1866, a working transatlantic cable was operational and carrying commercial traffic. What's striking about that era is how familiar the economics look. These cables were built by syndicates of private investors, often with loose government backing, because whoever controlled the cable controlled the intelligence, financial, political, military. The British Empire understood this with unusual clarity. By the time World War I began, Britain controlled roughly half the world's submarine cable network, and one of its first acts of war was to cut Germany's cables in the English Channel. Information infrastructure was strategic infrastructure. That was obvious then. The 20th century brought telecommunications monopolies, AT&T, British Telecom, France Telecom, and they inherited this logic. They funded cables as a consortium, sharing capacity and cost. The system worked after a fashion. But it was built for voice telephone traffic, not the internet, and it was owned by institutions whose primary business was managing scarcity. Then the internet arrived and broke the model completely. In the late 1990s, the dot-com boom triggered a frenzy of cable laying. Consortiums of telecoms companies poured capital into new systems, Flag, Me, We3, TAT14, betting that internet traffic would grow fast enough to fill them all. It grew faster than that. And then the bubble burst. The telecoms companies that had borrowed to build those cables went bankrupt. The cables themselves were sold off at fractions of their construction cost. This is when the first generation of internet companies started paying attention. By the early 2010s, something structurally new was happening. Google, then Facebook, then Amazon, and Microsoft had grown large enough that their own internal traffic, moving data between their own data centers, serving video and search and social feeds to billions of users simultaneously, was starting to equal or exceed the entire commercial internet of a decade earlier. Leasing capacity from a telecom consortium that you'd helped bankrupt wasn't a stable long-term strategy, so they started building their own. Google's Curie cable, completed in 2019, runs from Los Angeles to Chile. Their Dunant cable crosses the Atlantic. The Equiano cable runs from Portugal down the west coast of Africa. And those are just the wholly owned systems. Google also holds partial stakes in more than a dozen consortium cables. Meta, Microsoft, and Amazon have followed similar paths. By 2023, hyperscalers, meaning Google, Meta, Microsoft, and Amazon, owned or co-owned roughly 70% of international submarine cable bandwidth. The institutions that built the modern internet effectively built its physical backbone as well, and they did it quietly, over about 15 years, without most people noticing. This is probably the largest infrastructure acquisition in modern history that never trended on social media, which is ironic, given who owns it. If you find that kind of quietly enormous story worth following, this channel exists to dig into exactly that. Subscribe. This matters because the old consortium model, for all its inefficiency, distributed risk and ownership across dozens of companies in dozens of countries. The new model concentrates it. And concentration, in infrastructure terms, always raises the same question. What happens when something breaks? There is a stretch of seabed between Egypt and Djibouti that deserves more attention than it gets. The Red Sea corridor carries somewhere between 15 and 17% of all global submarine cable traffic, an estimate derived from the International Telecommunication Union's published route surveys. 17 cable systems run through it. They all pass through the same narrow coastal shelf, in some places within a few kilometers of each other. In early 2024, 3 of those cables were cut in the space of a few weeks. The Houthi movement in Yemen, then actively targeting commercial shipping in the Red Sea, was linked to at least some of the damage, though the precise causes of each cut remain disputed. The result was a roughly 25% reduction in bandwidth capacity between Asia and Europe. Traffic rerouted. Latency on certain paths increased. It wasn't a catastrophic failure. It was a demonstration. Cable cuts are, in fact, common. Around 200 occur worldwide every year, mostly from ship anchors and fishing trawlers, occasionally from submarine landslides on continental slopes. The vast majority are repaired within weeks by a small fleet of specialized cable repair ships. There are roughly 60 of those ships globally. They are one of the more obscure critical infrastructure fleets in existence. Purpose-built vessels with massive cable tanks, below decks, and grappling systems that can locate and retrieve a cable in 4,000 meters of water. But here is what nobody in the repair ship business will tell you publicly. The repair queue matters. If 5 cables are cut in the same corridor in the same week, the recovery timeline is not 5 times the single cable recovery time. It's longer because ships must travel, schedule, and work serially. In a scenario involving deliberate, coordinated cutting in a single choke point, the compounding effect could extend outages from weeks to months. The Luzon Strait is another concentration point. More than a dozen cables linking East Asia to the United States pass through or near it. Taiwan, which sits at the center of this corridor and produces the majority of the world's advanced semiconductors, has already experienced deliberate cable cuts to its outlying islands, attributed by Taiwanese authorities to Chinese vessels, though China has denied involvement. And here is where it gets stranger. The legal framework governing these cables has barely changed since 1884. The International Convention for the Protection of Submarine Cables was signed in 1884. The same decade, the first truly global cable network was being built. It made deliberate cable cutting a criminal offense under the law of the nation whose ship committed it. It established the right of cable-laying ships to display a warning signal. It required other vessels to give them space. It did not anticipate autonomous underwater vehicles. It did not anticipate state-sponsored sabotage disguised as commercial activity. It did not anticipate a world where the same fiber that carries a video call also carries $1 trillion of financial settlement transactions every single day. The 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea updated some provisions. Malicious damage to cables is now an offense under international law, technically. But enforcement is nearly impossible when the cut happens in international waters. The vessel involved has changed its AIS identification, and the flag state has no particular interest in prosecution. What's genuinely surprising is that NATO didn't treat this as a pressing concern until Russian submarine activity near critical cable infrastructure was reported in the North Atlantic around 2017. A UK parliamentary report that year described the risk in strikingly direct terms, noting that Russian submarines and spy ships were operating near cable systems in ways that didn't make sense commercially. It took another Baltic cable incident in 2024, the Estlink 2 power cable between Finland and Estonia, severed when a Chinese-flagged vessel dragged its anchor across it to push the issue into mainstream security policy discussions. The gap between the scale of what's at stake and the maturity of the legal and military response to it is, to put it plainly, remarkable. NATO has now established a dedicated maritime infrastructure protection unit. The EU has a cable resilience roadmap, but as of the time of this script, neither has produced binding enforcement mechanisms with real teeth. So here's the answer to the question we started with. We built a civilization-critical network and left it largely unarmored because of a convergence of factors that each made individual sense. The deep ocean was considered hostile enough to be self-protecting. Cables were commercial assets, not military ones, so no government took primary ownership of their security. The economics of the Internet's growth meant that any gap in capacity was quickly filled by new cables, making resilience seem inherent. And the companies that came to own the system had every incentive to lay more cable and very little incentive to publicize how exposed what they'd already laid was. What's changed is that the exposure is no longer theoretical. The Red Sea cuts in 2024 were not catastrophic, and that's worth sitting with. The network rerouted, traffic found paths, the internet did not go dark. But that resilience was the product of years of overcapacity built for commercial reasons, not security ones. As traffic continues to grow, and as bandwidth demand from AI inference and high-definition video keeps doubling roughly every 2 years, the margin between inconvenient reroute and genuine fracture is narrowing. There is a researcher at the Atlantic Council named Stacy Pettyjohn who has described undersea infrastructure as the soft underbelly of the digital economy. That's a carefully chosen phrase. Soft because it's unarmored, underbelly because it's hidden below the surface, and it's an economy because the people who built it were optimizing for bandwidth per dollar, not for resilience per adversary. The 400 cables on the ocean floor are extraordinary. They are one of the genuine engineering achievements of the modern world. And almost none of the people whose lives depend on them know that they exist, where they run, or what it would actually take to protect them. If this got you, the next episode on this channel is about the small fleet of ships whose only job is to find and repair the cables we just spent 13 minutes worrying about, and why there aren't nearly enough of them.